This is Rumble, and I'm Michael Moore. Welcome, everyone. 3 days after Donald Trump was elected President of the United States, I was asked to make my first appearance on Morning Joe on MSNBC. And so I went there to 30 Rock early in the morning, and I was joined by our guest here today on Rumble. He and I and a couple of others, we began a conversation about what just happened. How did it happen? And Joe Scarborough did not break for a commercial for nearly 45 minutes. I'd never seen anything like this on any cable news, unless it was some, breaking event. A plane had crashed, something like a plane crashing, like Donald Trump being elected president of the United States. My guest on my podcast here today is Eddie Glaude, professor and actually the chair of the African American Studies Department at Princeton University, an incredible author. He wrote the book Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul. And he has a new book out this week, a brand new book, which I just read here over the weekend. It's called Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. Welcome, Eddie.
Hi, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here with you, man.
That morning, if you do remember.
Oh, I remember it like yesterday.
And to share that time with you in Anand, it was good for my soul, because even though I had anticipated Trump's victory, I did so only in the hopes that I would be horribly wrong and proven wrong by the American people. And so to sit on that panel that morning and to listen to your analysis of it was in some strange way comforting. During a week when there was very little comfort to be had. Do you mind just sharing your thoughts in those 72 hours after Trump's election? Because that week was an intense week, and that morning sitting there with you was profoundly intense. And I'm curious where you were at, and maybe if you could just share with people who didn't see that episode of Morning Joe, what you felt like in terms of what you were in the midst of not just that show, but in the midst of an America that said to you, to me, to many people, but especially if you are not white, that night after we did the show, I had dinner with some friends, and one of the friends and people at the table was Lynn Nottage, Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright, wonderful writer, and she started to cry, and it felt so. She said, "I have had the sense this week that I've got the message. That I'm not wanted, and I'm not valued, and I get it." Wow. It was so I haven't had a chance really to talk to you about what you were going through emotionally and every other level of, of how we were processing this. But
yeah, so, I was in a state of disbelief, because I was moving through different, how can I put this, Michael? I was in different arenas, different sites. So I spent that night calling the election or analyzing the results as they came in on Amy Goodman's show, Democracy Now! And I remember as we were sitting in real time and we realized that Donald Trump was going to win. And I whispered, "Oh shit." And Amy looked like she saw a ghost. And we realized that the country had actually done this, right? And the next morning I was supposed to be on Morning Joe. This is before our show. And they had a live audience. And the audience was made up of folk who were obviously Clinton supporters. And it was as if we were at a funeral. You know, people were just stunned. They were in a daze, you know, like some tragic event had happened and people were trying to process the consequence of it all. And then we were together, I think a couple of days later or a day or so later, and trying to talk about what this meant for the nation. And I was feeling at the time, because I had been advocating for to push the Democratic Party left, wanted the Clinton folk to do more with regards to putting forward a progressive agenda, that they couldn't take Black voters for granted. I had written in Democracy in Black that if the Democratic Party had failed to do so, then we should blank out, and the like, if you lived in decidedly red states, so that we could impact the 2020 convention. And I was like, over and over again in my head, Michael, I was saying to myself, how could I overestimate white people? How could I overestimate them? I did not believe that they would elect someone so obviously underqualified to be president of the United States. But that's not the issue, you know? And I just kept saying to myself, how could I do this? And so when we got together, and that conversation began to happen, and I remember Joe telling me to just listen to you, right? Listen to you. And then you remember when we looked up, everybody from behind in the control room had come out.
Yes.
And so we had, the floor was full of folk who had just come out of wherever they were to watch to witness the conversation. And I just, even in the midst of the conversation, I kept saying to myself, they did it again. They did it again. I'll be damned.
Yeah, this was that morning. There was no audience, but 15, 20 minutes into it, there was an audience of people who had just come in from wherever at NBC, at MSNBC, and just stood there. But I remember thinking too that what I was trying to say in terms of why did Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, why did these states go for Trump, and what I had understood in terms of what I had witnessed during the months leading up to the campaign, and they were things that just weren't being reported, and people were kind of just taking a lot of things for granted, including the candidate. When she didn't come to Wisconsin, she came, I think, once to Michigan, but basically stayed out of Michigan. And it was very surprising, I think, to a lot of people, and depressed the vote in the sense that Clinton only lost Michigan by an average of 2 votes per precinct. Yeah. It shouldn't have happened.
Yeah, it was political malfeasance.
Yes.
On so many levels, but anyway.
Yes. Is there a thing, can we call malpractice at all on political parties? I'm just curious. There's a law that allows the people to sue. But so in these now almost 4 years, going on 4 years, you and I and others have had to live through this. Have we lived through it?
That's a great question.
I mean, we're still alive, but
yeah.
But now we have 4 years of institutional knowledge, as they say, of what this has been like, and what we're going to do, or what we are doing, I hope, to prevent this from happening again. And as I've said many times in this podcast, I never take Trump for granted, and we already have seen the effects of when we or others, have done that.
Well, I mean, what we've witnessed, and as you know better than most folks, is the kind of erosion of democratic norms, a kind of license for folk to rob the public coffers. We've seen an intensification of racial animus. The partisan divide that was so much a part of the story of 2016. We knew then that partisan divide was really a way of tracking deep racial divisions in the country. The institutions of our democracy have been weakened, if not, how can I put this? Being a country boy from Mississippi, I guess I would say that it's like the termites have eaten the wood. It looks like it's okay, but just step on it, So the foundations of the institutions of American democracy are in real jeopardy. So, we've lived through it. I suppose we're surviving, but the moment is one of real danger for the country. And this election cycle, as some were clamoring for bold visions, for a response to the crisis at the scale of the level of the crisis, we saw forces at work in the political process that really clung to the status quo. And so now we have to figure out how to do two things simultaneously, and that is get Trump out of office and insist on a new way of thinking about how this country will work. Because right now it's decidedly broken.
You write in your book here, Begin Again, that this new way that we need, I think you call it a third founding of this country. Describe what you mean by that, because I found it it really stimulated a lot of ideas in my head in terms of there's the sort of the short-term thing that we need to do the year that we're in right now. But then there's the much larger thing, the what I call the thing that gave us Trump, that Trump didn't fall out of the sky, that, if we don't deal with that too, then we are destined to just repeat what we've been through. So just explain to people what you mean by a third founding. I think most of us learned in school when the first founding was, but maybe explain the second and tell what you mean by the third.
So, the second founding happened in the context of the Civil War and Reconstruction and radical Reconstruction. So here the country, the contradiction at the heart of the nation, the serpent wrapped around the legs upon which the Constitution was signed, or the Declaration of Independence was signed, was slavery, and that serpent threatened to swallow everything whole. And the country came to blows, introduced modern warfare to the world, a level of carnage the world had never seen before, as brother turned against brother, over the issue of slavery. And in the context of Reconstruction and radical Reconstruction, more specifically, there was an attempt to literally found a multiracial democracy, because in the context of the Civil War, we get the emergence of what we call the modern U.S. nation state. So historians call this the second founding because you get the modern conception of American citizenship. You get the idea of taxation that allows the country to connect one coast to the other. You get a range of policies that move us out of our particular states and locales to a much more robust understanding of the federal government. And so in the process of this happening, we get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments passed, which really changed the ground of how we imagine the American polity. But in the midst of that, right, Stevens and others going back to our first works, trying to do our first works over, trying to resolve the contradiction at the initial founding, then had to face immediately a counter-revolution, right? And that rearguard action involved doubling down on the ugliness of race, right? And so you get in the second founding the response of Jim Crow, the passage of racial apartheid laws in the South. You see convict leasing, right? We think we're talking about, the recent decision to remove the battle flag, Confederate flag from Mississippi state flag, right? That decision was made in 1894, right? When the first laws of Jim Crow were being passed, and of course, Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which won't get overturned to 1954 with Brown v. Board of Education. So the second founding is this extraordinary moment in which the modern U.S. nation state comes into being, and there's an attempt to found a multiracial democracy, but then the country betrays it. It turns its back on it by doubling down on our ugly racial commitments. Lost cause actually wins out. Jim Crow takes hold of the South. De facto desegregation continues to define the North. Racialized imperial ambition across the globe. At the very moment, Michael, as the very moment in which we're consolidating a racial regime in the South, we're incorporating millions of black and brown people across the globe as a result, in the Philippines and Cuba and the like, as a result of our imperial ambition. So Anglo-Saxonism takes off and takes root. The Empire of Liberty looks a different way in some ways. So that's the second founding and its betrayal. What we need is a third founding. And what I mean by that is we need to tell ourselves a different story about who we are. Right? We need to think about a different way of imagining the public good. What are our responsibilities to each other? To turn our backs on the noxious views around race, to stop saying that we want to invite people to the table and understand that, damn it, the table that we have was built by all of us, right? It's not yours to invite me to sit down at it. I helped make it. And to begin to think about at the level of story and then at the level of policy, how do we uproot, right, this point that you made earlier, uproot this idea that because you're white, you ought to be valued more than others in this country. And that's going to require work at the level of policy, work at the level of symbol in terms of our built environment, and work at the level of story in terms of what is the American story? How do we tell it? And all of this will, of course, require some really hard work and hard questions and answers for us. That's our moment, it seems to me.
What does that work involve? What do you think? What is it that we need to, people listening to this right now are saying, well, what can I do? What is it that, can I do something beyond just voting or just, even protesting in the streets or whatever? All of these things, obviously, I don't mean to say just, because voting and protesting are like two of the critical things that we need to be doing right now. But as I read this, I just thought, yes, a third founding that we're going to get one more crack at redemption here, and that we're going to be living in we already are living in a different country. I say this to fellow white people all the time. You do know that there's a clock that's ticking here, and I think it's like every September for the last 8 or 9 years, the majority of first graders entering school in the United States of America have not been white. And that sometime in the 2040s, white people are going to be the minority. Not the minority in terms of, just to be honest, I think that economic power and who's going to be calling the shots will not just end on New Year's Eve, 2042.
Right.
But the actual numbers of people, the actual numbers of eligible voters are not going to be white. And so what kind of America do you want to live in at that point? And why not start living in it now? Why don't we ramp up to this new day? And as you say, why don't we consider a third founding of this country? And because we know what we got wrong, why don't we make an attempt starting right now to get it right? And to do that, like just off the top of your head, what would be some of those things we could actually attempt to do now in the 2020s and not wait until the 2040s?
Right. I think, one of the things we know is that policy drives change, it seems to me. It can drive change, right? So we need to be clamoring for policies that actually reject what we've been living under for the last 40 to 50 years. Right? You know as well as I do that, Ronald Reagan's election in 1980 sealed the death of a particular era of the New Deal, right? And introduced an idea of governance where government was small. Its primary function was to secure the defense and the efficient working of the economy. It eroded any idea of a robust sense of the social safety net as it reduced us from being citizens concerned about the public good to just simply being private individuals in pursuit of our self-interest in competition and rivalry with others. And the result of that shift, of course, was the devastation of American workers, the exploitation of white resentments and fears, the extraction of resources from communities of hardworking communities to folks who have really no value add to the economy. Those are those hedge fund managers and all those other folks, right? So we see the expanding of the wealth gap. We see the deepening of racial divides. We see an aggressive policing model. What we are experiencing right now, I think, Michael, is the collapse of that particular period. All of that is seen as bankrupt. And the only thing these folk can rely on is their hatred, is to appeal to our fears. And so we have to address this idea that a more just world is a zero-sum game for white folks, right? That they got to give up something in order for us to be a more just society. So the first thing we need to do is start opening up space for a more robust understanding of the public good. Well, healthcare is not defined by where you work, but by a general assumption that we as a society are committed to the value that no one should go broke because they're sick, that GDP shouldn't decline because hospitals can't have elective surgery, that sort of thing, right? So part of what we have to do is, I think, on the one hand, and this is what you have been doing and others have been doing, is that we have to argue for a robust policy vision to change the center of gravity of the country, right? We have to move it from stakeholders to shareholders, right? Or is it the other way around? You get the point I'm making, right? From producers to workers, we have to flip it. Again, we have to not just simply have a social safety net. We have to have a public infrastructure of care. We have to build that. But the reason we haven't built it, the reason why we've dismantled what little we had, is because we thought we were taking stuff from hardworking white folk and giving it to lazy, undeserving black folk and brown folk. So at the heart of our policy debates, in so many ways, has been this noxious, insidious understanding of race, of white supremacy. So we have to uproot it because it overdetermines so much of what we do. So the first part of my answer to your question is that we have to advocate for a much more progressive, bold vision of who we are as a country, how we are to be together with each other, what constitutes the public good. Then the second part of that involves this, and this is what makes this moment so interesting to me as protest about the public lynching of George Floyd and the brutality of police, how that protest has morphed into an attack on public monuments and how we remember, right? Because it's the history that haunts. It's those ghosts continue to move us about. And so what does it mean for Princeton to still celebrate Woodrow Wilson or Yale at one point having John C. Calhoun up, or Robert E. Lee to still be standing in Charlottesville, or what's happening in Charleston, or Nathan Bedford Forrest in the State House in Tennessee and the like? What does it mean for these monuments to still be around in public space? What are these monuments commending to us? And then to think about those monuments in a different way, that we focus on the Confederate monuments, but what about the highways in Chicago? The zoning laws across the country that have produced this segregated society, Michael, where you and I are mysteries to each other because our lives rarely intersect. And when they do, we say hello, we work, and then we go home and we go back to our segregated networks. Right? How do we begin to tell a story about our being together where we imagine community in different ways right? And I was having this conversation with Steve Schmidt the other day, and he was like, well, we want to invite everyone to the table. I said, stop inviting me to your damn table.
Yeah. What are the ways? Because I think that I think we are in a very important moment right now. This particular year, what's happened, none of which we could have predicted a few months ago. And yet we could, if our eyes had been open. Whether we're talking about the treatment of science, and I should say the mistreatment of science leading up to this pandemic that we're in, the continual abuse and violence by police against Black citizens. There's nothing new about that. But of course Trump, but something does feel different in the air. I don't know what it is. We get these little tiny things every day in the news where last night the NBA announced that when they come back into playing basketball, Black Lives Matter is going to be painted on the floor of the arena. Every few hours, something like that happens. And sometimes they feel like ridiculous things. Band-Aid announced they're going to finally make Band-Aids in different shades for all colors of people. They might have left out Asian Americans in that rainbow there, but but you know what I'm saying, right? Every day now, there's something going on, or you're watching a commercial and you think it might be a political ad from the NAACP or whatever, and it's from Procter and Gamble. It's like, what's going on here? I mean, your university, you mentioned Woodrow Wilson this past week took his name down. This is considered one of our important presidents. And yet there's people are like, why is his name gone? And I was going to ask you at some point in this conversation to just give a brief Princeton history and Woodrow Wilson history as to why that happened. But my point is that there is something in the air. While I laugh at some of this, I also realize that, when you've got all the good old boys at NASCAR, taking down the Confederate flags and pushing Bubba Wallace's car onto the track and standing behind him, you're like, the cynic in you wants to say, okay, more window dressing, more icing, but then the optimist in you starts to go, maybe something is happening, and maybe we should seize the moment. I'm curious your thoughts on all of that.
Well, something is happening, something is different about the moment. I think there's a generation, millennials and Gen Zers, who have grown up, who've come of age in the midst of catastrophe, from Katrina to the Great Recession, to mass school shootings, to police murders, to pandemic, to economic collapse. Right. Student loan debt surpasses credit card debt. They're moving home. Jobs aren't available. So they're growing up, right, in a moment that seems to suggest that the country's broken. And some of them end up in the Bernie Sanders campaign, or working with Jill Stein, or being a part of Occupy and Black Lives Matter. Others turn out to be like Richard Spencer or Dylan Roof. Right, or identifying with the Boogaloo Boys or something like that, because they know whatever this is not working. So there's that judgment, I think, that's happening. I think there's a fundamental reckoning that some are coming to understand that the country cannot survive if it continues to lock up large portions of its talent. That America cannot survive leaving most of its talent off the field, right? In so many ways. It can't compete in the world in that way. And I'm thinking from the vantage point of business, right? They know who they're competing against. They know that they don't have the luxury of the devastation of World War II, where they're the sole economy functioning at the highest level, right? They know that the marketplace, the competition is much stiffer, and we can't continue to do business as usual. There is something different about the moment, and we see activists on the ground who have been organizing for decades. You know, when people hear the defund black police, the defund the police kind of slogan, they think it just came up. No, it's part of the justice reinvestment movement that's been going on for a long time. You and I know what's been happening with Fight for 15, with the arguments around living wage. We can just point to all of this work that's been happening daily, right, outside of the camera, that then kind of sets the conditions for what we experience. So something is different, but there's no guarantee. There's no guarantee. You know, let's put it this way. After the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century, social science data showed that there was a decline, a precipitous decline in racist opinion held by white Americans. So the data showed very clearly, Michael, that white Americans held less racist opinions, right, as the years passed post the civil rights movement. So their position around interracial marriage, their position around, segregated schools and the like, they were clear that they were against these things. But the social science data also revealed that as these attitudes changed, they became more, shall we say, open. At the same time, there is a reluctance to embrace policy to remedy systemic inequality. So I'm against segregated schools, but I'm also against affirmative action. I'm against, you see the difference. So what we can see here is perhaps a change in attitude, but we don't know if that actually translates into a support of policy for a more racially just society, if that makes sense.
And when you say policy, what could we, you're right. I mean, and to people listening to this who have spent years working to raise the minimum wage or to stop the militarization of our police departments, or, I mean, a lot of these are very local movements too. They're connected nationally and in kind of a loose way sometimes, and sometimes it's a local union, or it's a local it's a small mid-sized city where people are doing these things. I live in a small town up in northern Michigan, and people in that town 2 weeks ago went to the city commission meeting and the county commission and asked that the police wear body cameras, and the police were like, "Oh, okay, it's not a bad idea, actually." And it was like one meeting, and they kind of, the commission decided to just do it. And I thought, well, that's really strange. And again, these were mostly white people at the meeting. I should say the virtual meeting, because the city council meetings are held via Zoom. But I have a sense, and I think that the people who are protesting, and I encourage everybody to keep this going, because the more it keeps going, the more we're going to get, I think, closer to some change happening. But you and I, Eddie, we're kind of humbugs about settling for cosmetic changes or little tiny things that just make everybody feel better. And when I say everybody, I'm talking about white people. But I think that I'm fit to be tied right now, frankly. I'm so upset and angry, and more so than I've ever been, and more committed to taking this. Don't go halfway. Don't say it so that everybody feels okay. Let's just say it. I've seen you on some TV shows in the last month or two where you suddenly didn't sound like a department chair at Princeton University. No offense to Princeton or department chairs in general, but you're a gentle soul in the sense of a good and compassionate and kind human being. But the rage that's there, and the way that you've expressed the rage in very moving ways, and I've had friends and family will text me, did you just see Eddie on such and such show? Oh my God, try to get the audio or something. He just went for it, and you have gone for it. You have picked up that ball and moved it down the field in ways that I don't know if they would have let you, or me even, but you carry the ball that way a year ago even.
Yeah, this has been an exhausting time, right?
Yes, and I'm talking about your rage.
Yeah, I was been working on this Baldwin book, and Baldwin is always moving between rage and love.
Yes, let's. Before I was just going to get into James Baldwin, which is just sort of the thread through this book. But for our younger listeners, they maybe or maybe there are still some people who haven't heard of James Baldwin, or they've heard the name but they don't know quite who he was or what he said or did. And I have been fan is such a weak word of James Baldwin since I was young. Just take a minute and explain James Baldwin to the people listening.
Sure. He's one of America's greatest writers. Born in Harlem, August 2nd, 1924. Died in France, December 1st, 1987, of cancer. Wrote extraordinary works of nonfiction and fiction, offering an understanding of America and its central contradictions. In some ways, I read Baldwin as the inheritor of Ralph Waldo Emerson. On the one hand, you get this extraordinary work like Go Tell It on the Mountain, which is a kind of migrant tale, a boy coming of age, trying to figure out how he's going to exist in a world that denies him standing because of his race, because of his class position, because of his sexual desire in some ways. And then you get these wonderful essays, Notes of a Native Son, and plays like a play like Amen Corner, or novel like Giovanni's Room, which is one of the first novels in American in American literature that's explicit about the sexuality of its characters in some ways. It's an extraordinary gesture, writing novels like Another Country and the like. But he's most famous for his 1963 book of essays entitled The Fire Next Time, where he, in effect, prophesies the city's, exploding, and offering us this language of love in the face of his rage, And he's also, in the midst of becoming this world-famous writer, he's also participating in the civil rights movement, raising funds, became a member, according to one of his biographers, of CORE and SNCC, found himself in Selma on one of the actions confronting Sheriff Clark, and then lived long enough to see not only the assassination of Medgar Evers and Malcolm X, but the brutal assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And in some ways, Michael, he collapsed, he fell apart, fell to pieces, trying to make sense of, right, how could a nation kill such an apostle of love? And then you get the later work, No Name in the Street, 1972, Devil Finds Work, which is an extraordinary book of essays on film, If Beale Street Could Talk, and of course his last novel, Just Above My Head. So over 7,000 pieces of writing in the corpus, perhaps one of the most insightful writers about the American enterprise that we've ever produced.
Yes, his love-hate relationship with a country of his birth, he realized that at an early age that he was not going to be allowed to be himself, to live the life he wanted to live. left, lived in exile, his own self-imposed exile, and then at a certain point decided that he had to come back and he had to be part of the fight. And if people have not seen this documentary from a couple of years ago by the filmmaker Raoul Peck called "I Am Not Your Negro," about James Baldwin and his writings, and it's basically, the film is based on his unfinished. It actually was just his pitch to his agent about a book he wanted to write and never did because he died. But he, if you have a chance to see this documentary, I encourage people to see it. But you in this book, you weave in and out of this love-hate relationship, and in fact, you talk about how you talk about this need for this third founding of our country, right. And he referred to it more of we need a new Jerusalem. Yeah. Explain what he meant by that.
Right. There's a line in this essay that he wrote. It's a letter, really, upon his resignation from the Liberator, which is a nationalist organization that had expressed anti-Semitic views. And he has this line where he says, "I want us to do something unprecedented. And that is create a self without the need for enemies." You know? And there's this, isn't that a powerful line? And this idea that we could actually imagine ourselves otherwise, that we could leave behind those categories that bind us, right? Those categories that imprison us. And he's not talking in any kind of sentimental humanist way that we're all just simply human beings. That's not Baldwin at all. But what he's trying to suggest is that we've created these categories that blind us to the human beings that are right in front of us, to all of their particularities, all of their faults and foibles, their vulnerabilities, and their profound joys. And so he's constantly clamoring for a way of living that will put the human being right, as he said once, that will put us right. And in some ways, that formulation is a formulation coming out of the academy that we would call NonDomination, right? What does it mean to stand in right relation to one's fellows, right? And so this New Jerusalem is this idea that we can imagine a world where the fullness of our individuality can be expressed. Where if one expressed a kind of, where you weren't just simply queer or straight, androgynous, however you want to describe your sexuality, it didn't matter, right? You just lived the life that was yours, and you lived it in relationship with others, in genuine mutuality. And so the New Jerusalem involved a world shorn, right, of the ugliness of the modern world. And the modern world, of course, is a world that came into being precisely because of slavery and the greed of capitalism and the like. So, it is his faith, his abiding faith, that wherever human beings are, we have a chance. He constantly said that we were both miracles and disasters at the same time. I riff on that by saying we're miracles and sons of bitches, and we have to protect ourselves from the disasters that we've become. But we also have to realize that we are miracles, that we can be miraculous at times in how we change the course of events.
You quote him, he said, and I'm going to botch this so you can make it right for me here, but that in order to feel, you really can't feel pain, true pain, unless you're willing to feel the pain of others. Do you know what I'm referring to?
Absolutely.
I found that to be such a profound way to look at things, because in our own narcissism, we often get consumed with what I'm going through, or the pain that I'm suffering, or whatever. And it's real. It's not that it isn't real, but just explain to people this.
That's a great quote, Mike. That's a great quote, because in some ways he's saying to us that our suffering is the bridge.
Right.
Right. In To Crush a Serpent, he talks about the way in which our suffering opens us to each other. And in an earlier piece, he says that in some ways that if, and I'm paraphrasing here, of course, is that if I'm able to tend to your suffering, maybe I can deal with my own better, and that we both can come out of this differently, And it seems to me that's a powerful point. When I was doing the research for the book, I was in the Schomburg Library that holds his papers, and I came across a little note. It's on a hand, like in those little memo pads from back in the day.
Yeah.
And it's a note to Robert F. Kennedy. It's a note to Robert Kennedy, right? And it's right after John F. Kennedy had been assassinated. And Baldwin is writing on behalf of that group that met with Robert Kennedy earlier in '63. And he's saying, in effect, whatever got in the way of our understanding in that meeting, suffering can bring us together is what we share. And I hope you will allow us to share in your grief. And he uses that moment in Robert Kennedy's life, in the life of the country, to use it as a bridge so that our suffering can connect each other, where we could see each other's humanity. It was a beautiful little note.
It's beautiful and it's very powerful. If we would only be willing to do that.
Yeah.
I guess we have to do it. I guess in some ways now, the way I'm feeling today, here in July of 2020, that we don't have a choice. And our younger people, young adults and teenagers, seem very willing to share that, to be part of that grief, and to do what they can do. I'm talking, young white people, but young African Americans also. Am I wrong to have this hope that I have for the millennials, and especially these Gen Zers, Zoomers, whatever the name is? I mean, you're on a campus every day mostly, so you're around them. I'm curious. Do you share that hope that I have? Because for me, it's not even just a hope. I'm actually learning, and I'm being inspired, and I'm revved up.
Yeah, I think yes, you're justified. We can't be Pollyannish about it, because the ugliness is still obtains. But I think it's clear to me that they bring a different skill set to the table, that they are grappling with the reality of the world as it is, that, there's no guarantee that we're going to hand them a world that's better than the one that we were handed, that they are clamoring for something different, It seems to me that that's right. But, Jimmy has this wonderful line, hope is invented every day. It's invented every day. And so, we have to figure out how to muster the strength in the midst of all of this shit to keep fighting, And these young folk have to figure out, right, what flourishing means for them. And, they're doing so in the context of the disaster that is Trump. What was the temperature in Siberia not too long ago, Mike? The planet is screaming, right? They're inheriting a planet that is in serious jeopardy. This generation in front of us, their hands are full. And we can only hope to be wind beneath their wings, I pray. But Lord knows what they have to do.
And they have a right to be angry at the world that they've been handed.
Oh, absolutely. Pissed, to be honest with you. You see, we've given them a world where, these folks living in gated communities are extracting resources. Can you imagine Jeff Bezos is going to be a trillionaire? And he's taking health care away from folks who work at Whole Foods? Or has he already taken it, Could you imagine, given how much wealth he has, anybody who works for Amazon or Whole Foods could easily live a middle-class life? Easily. right? But we have people who are hoarding, extracting, right? Isolating, constantly engaged in an ongoing effort to eviscerate any idea of the public good in the name of their own selfishness and greed. So they have every right to be angry, rageful even.
You mentioned capitalism a bit ago. What role does our economic system play in this? How much of do you think that capitalism is the enemy of the good that we're trying to achieve, and how do we go about this? Because as you mentioned, Bezos and others who just a handful own more than half the wealth in this country. How do you come at this? Even though I don't think you're an economist.
Yeah,
you're the chair of the African American Studies Department. You also, I know you speak a lot about theology and its impact and history and whatever. But where does capitalism come into play here?
Well, I think I have a series of intuitions about capitalism, right? As a young graduate student, I read Das Kapital and I read my Marx and all this other stuff, but it never settled into my way of seeing the world. In some ways, it's not a language that comes natural to me, but there is something that comes natural or is organic to how I see the world, and that is a common sense of decency that I get from my mama and my daddy. Right? That if you have an economic system that presumes that some people are disposable, right? That you can just simply use them up and then discard them, then that economic system at its root is cruel and evil, it seems to me. And what we have here is folks who are working 40 to 60 hours a week trying to make ends meet, and making wages where they have to make choices between keeping a roof over their head or putting food on the table. They can't afford to send their kids to school. It used to be that a high school education would give you an opportunity to at least live a middle-class life. My dad did that. My mother didn't graduate from high school, but my dad ended up working for the post office. And by virtue of that, I was able to live a middle-class life because of what that the post office meant for us. He was the second African-American hired in Pascagoula, Mississippi, and ended up leading the union down there. And so the dignity of work, instead we have a system that is all about extraction, right? And disposability of those who are seen or deemed as less valued. And as long as we have an economic system, Mike, that functions like locusts, right? We're all in jeopardy. It leaves nothing behind but destruction and devastation. Now, that doesn't mean I don't believe in markets. It doesn't mean, I believe in a command economy. But what it means is, I affirm the sacrality of human life more than anything in the world. And this economic system, right, is plays fast and loose with human beings. And to me, that's disgusting.
And what do we do? What do we do about it?
We have to begin from a fundamental assumption. And this is an assumption that I don't think we all agree on. That human beings matter more than the acquisition of profit, right? That we matter, right? That human dignity and standing ought to be central values. The sacrality of human life ought to be central to how we imagine the good life in this country. Now, I sound like a naive moralist in that moment. But the moment in which we begin to devalue people, and I know this, Michael, because I come out of a tradition of people who have been devalued. The moment we begin to devalue people, we open the door for all sorts of cruelty and barbarity. And we've seen it over the course of Western modernity. And what we know is that capitalism, as it is currently imagined, is not working.
In your book here, Begin Again, I want you to just speak to just a few things before we wrap up. Chapter 1 is called The Lie. Explain to our listeners the lie.
The lie is this story that we tell ourselves about American democracy as an example of democracy achieved. That Americans are the most virile, the most just, that we are a redeemer nation, the shining city on the hill. And it involves that the effectiveness, the efficiency of that narrative that protects us from all the evils that we do and that we have done. Jimmy had this wonderful line in a 1964 essay entitled "The White Problem," and I think this gets at the heart of what I mean by at least one aspect of the lie. He says the people who settled the country had a fatal flaw, Michael. They could recognize a man when they saw one. They knew he wasn't anything else but a man. But since they were Christian, and since they had already decided that they came here to establish a free country, the only way to justify the role this chattel was playing in one's life was to say that he was not a man. For if he wasn't, then no crime had been committed. That lie, Jimmy writes, is the basis of our present trouble. So the lies we tell about Black folk to protect our innocence, the ways in which we tell our history in order to hide from view the stuff that we've done in the world, what we've done in Haiti, what we've done in Cuba, what we've done in the Philippines, right? The stories we tell ourselves that allow us to be okay with what we did in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Right? And then the way in which our story works, Michael, the way in which we will malform any story that tries to reveal the reality of who we actually are. Right? That's the lie that we have to confront in order to free ourselves up. And just really quickly, this is really key. You know, the early days of the celebration of the 4th of July, Black people were not allowed to go. We were not allowed to attend. In fact, the early days before the 4th of July became a celebrated holiday, a national holiday, it was the day that the American Colonization Society used to raise money in order to ship African peoples out of the country. But in New York, in the 1830s, we showed up to one of the July 4th celebration days, and we were physically attacked. Why? Because our bodies represented the contradiction of the celebration. We were the mirror that the nation did not want to look into.
Wow. It's the lie and the lies that we tell ourselves, about our past. And that's the importance of this book and I just love this. I can't recommend this enough to people to pick this up and read it. The way that you draw these connections from our past, from our history into what we're dealing with, right now. And it's very profound and very moving. You have another chapter called The Reckoning. I love this chapter. Explain to people what The Reckoning is.
The Reckoning is at that moment when the idealism of the civil rights movement gave way to Black power, right? That moment when, I tell the story in the beginning of that chapter when the Black Panther Party makes the wrong turn, when Bobby Seale and those groups and the Panthers make the wrong turn, and they end up in the State House in Sacramento, and they read that statement about the legislation that was being considered to in a way disarm Black folk from protecting themselves against police brutality. And I said, this was not King's movement. Jimmy was trying to make sense of the darkening of the eyes of all of those young people who risked their lives to change the country nonviolently. There's that wonderful moment in Eyes on the Prize when Stokely Carmichael said in an interview, Kwame Ture said in the interview, he said, we were in the bowels of the South. It wasn't about love. What we saw was raw terror. This wasn't about love. This was about power. And what that meant for the tone, the form and content of Black politics. And it's important that we tell that story, Michael, because what happens in the way in which we narrate the Black freedom struggle, We tell the story from 1954, Brown v. Board of Education, 1955, Montgomery bus boycott, the emergence of Dr. King, right? You get the nonviolent protests, you get the student sit-ins, which lead to 1960 and the organizing of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. You get the height of the civil rights movement with the March on Washington in 63, the drama of Selma in 65, and then King is murdered in 68. But when we think about 65 and 66, oh my God, there's the moment of decline. Stokely Carmichael in Greenwood, Mississippi declares, we are not going to take it anymore. I'm not going to jail anymore. What we want is black power. In October of 66, the Black Panther Party is founded in California. And then suddenly the Watts explodes in 65. Newark explodes. Detroit explodes, right? And then we tell this decline narrative. We tell this story of decline. Black power, these leather jacket wearing, black glove wearing, having beret, black afro wearing, however adjective we want to use, folk who just wanted to tear up the country. When in fact, black power is so much more complicated than that melodramatic narrative. It's a moment in which Black America is trying to pick up the pieces in light of the betrayal. And it calls the country to the carpet. And the country responds with hard hat revolutions, with clamorings for the silent majority to be heard, the forgotten American, call for carceral state. Oh my God, the devastation of that period.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about.
Yes. Well, I grew up during all of that. I've told this story before on the podcast of our mother. I have two sisters, and one of whom, by the way, teaches your books in her college class. She teaches at one of the Cal States.
Oh, wow.
Out there. And I told her last night that I'd be talking to you on the podcast today, and she said, just let him talk.
No, Michael, no.
Okay, so that's why I've been asking you. Tell us about the lie. But I've told this. But so my mom wanted us kids to learn about our nation's capital or whatever. So early summer, I think late spring, early summer of 65, drove us to Washington, D.C. And we went to our congressman's office and got tickets to get into the gallery. The House. I think it was the House. Could have been the Senate. What would I have been? I would have just ended 5th grade.
Wow.
And they let us in there and we sat down looking down onto the floor. And they were debating the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And we sat there for an hour or two watching this historic debate. Myself as an 11-year-old there. Wow. It had quite an impact on me. And the fact that would be gone at this point, that both because of the Republican Senate and then the Supreme Court, that essentially what we had is gone. And so much of what has, as you pointed out at the beginning of this podcast, has been eliminated, negated. A lot of it we haven't paid attention to because we've been so busy with the huge things that we've had to deal with Trump. And we've forgotten or we've missed so much. Some haven't, fortunately. But I really think we're at that, what you were describing there when you went through everything of those 20 years. We're at another crossroads here, and it really is going to be up to us now. We don't have Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Medgar Evers. By the way, Medgar Evers' widow is still alive. I did not know that.
Yeah.
And
Marley Eldridge,
she was in the news yesterday when the Mississippi removed the Confederate flag as part of the state flag, and what that meant to her, with her husband being assassinated there in Jackson, Mississippi. It's you see, it's not that long ago, is it? Really?
No.
And we had Barbara Lee on last week, and her grandfather, just her grandfather, was born a slave in the final weeks before Juneteenth in 1865. And I've talked here about how my grandfather was born in 1868, just 3 years after the Civil War. So when we talk about what the Civil War, what slavery, what all that means to today, it's not like ancient history. It certainly isn't with me. The stories from my grandfather from the 1860s just went down one generation to my mom and then into me. And it's not like, at least for me, these were stories that felt very real and very alive and still with us. And so here we are at the end of this podcast that, I don't know what the word is. Am I desperate? Am I so anxious? Have I been let down so many times before that are we just in another moment to be let down again? Or is this something different? And are we making it different? And what can we say to others who are listening to this, to draw upon that which we've lived through, that the history that we should all know, the history that's in this book here? What can we do now to really take this thing home, really make real change occur? And yes, remove Trump. We're all on board. But we know that there's much more to do. But I don't want to, in saying that, make it seem like it's so overwhelming that we can't do it. In your final words, I'll bring this up again because I have seen this. Maybe rage is the wrong word, but because you're not a person that speaks with rage. Yet, when you speak and when you write, it is piercing, and I think we're the better for it. And we need you to continue doing this. Sorry to put this on your shoulders, but as you leave us today, what can you leave us with? Not as I say to people, not the hopey hope stuff, but the real deal, the real world thing that's in front of us, and the power that maybe we don't even know that we have to fix things.
Well, I don't want to be presumptuous enough to think I have any answers. I know what I believe in my heart, and that is that we're in a moment of profound possibility and crisis. It is different, Michael. There are different folks in the street, different kinds of people, different races, different generations. We're in a moment because this place is broken. But the question for us is, will we choose safety or will we risk everything? Will we choose the illusion of comfort in safety, or will we risk everything to try to build a more just world? That's the thing. So people will tempt us to take the bribe of safety. They're going to tempt us to say, take this little gesture. They want us to tinker around the edges and leave the status quo alone. We know if we do that, we're choosing death, right? So my advice is to ask for everything, to demand for everything, to fight for everything, to shoot for the moon, to shoot for the stars. And if we land on the moon, then damn it, we've done something, right? So we have to risk everything because the future depends upon it. It's in our hands. So the moment is different. Will we give birth to a new America? It has everything to do with whether or not we're going to take full responsibility for our tasks to bring it into existence. I hope we can do it. I pray that we.
I don't think we have any choice.
Boom.
We do have to ask for everything. This is not the moment to compromise or to hold back or to try and play nice. Not that we're not nice people. I'm just saying that it is the moment to ask for everything that we need to make this a better country and a better world, to be a better people. But it will also require us risking everything. Again, just the young people who are in these protests every single day, risking their lives during a pandemic. And history will record this, that during a pandemic, when everybody knew they had to stay inside and not be near other people, took that risk of getting sick, of potentially dying, because this was more important. That we simply were not going to witness another lynching again. And of course, since George Floyd, we've had to watch other killings, both in real time, but also from what happened 6 months ago or a year ago, last August, with Elijah McClain in Aurora, Colorado. Unbelievable, vicious murder of a gentle soul. But it can't be just that. Yes, we have to reform the police, and yes, we have to stop this violence and all this. But it's how do you say this to people? Because I always feel like I'm presenting a big bag of things that have to get done, and it seems like we're not going to get any of it done. How do you communicate this to people so that it doesn't feel so overwhelming, where people just get swamped by the magnitude of what we have to do?
One step at a time.
Yeah.
One step at a time.
Yeah.
One task at a time. And the thing is, I have this moment in the book, Mike, where I say, I've dedicated my life to studying African American religion. And one of the things that I've come to understand and to really hold tight to my spirit is there was nothing about the condition of slavery which suggested to those who were enslaved that the world could be any different. They knew the world was what it was. They knew slavery was what it was, right? They had no real sense of what freedom was outside of looking at those folk who held absolute power over them. But when they looked in the eyes of someone who held their heart and they saw love, or when they saw the smile in their children's face, even if it was fleeting, it gave them the ability to imagine that the world could be otherwise. That gave them the ability to imagine that the world could be otherwise. So even given the magnitude of slavery, right, holding on to that ability to see beyond the opacity of now. So take one step at a time, right? One task at a time, right? One moment at a time. And if all of us are doing that simultaneously, do you know how large that is? How focused that is? And what's so beautiful about this podcast is that we're standing in solidarity with each other, telling the truth without any syrupy sentimentality, without any of the, we're standing in solidarity, saying out loud that we want to risk everything for a more just world, refusing to take the bribe. And we're going to do that one step at a time.
That's correct. And that I wake up every morning with that. I hadn't put it that way, but that's exactly, just look at each day as one step, but every day has to be a step for me, at least.
Yeah.
Because I can't live like this anymore. I can't live in a country like this anymore. And as I've said, I'm not going anywhere. So therefore,
indeed,
it has to change. Not me. It has to change.
Hallelujah. Amen. Amen.
So Woodrow Wilson, Princeton, your university, has taken his name down off a couple of buildings. I don't know if there was a statue or whatever, but he's now gone. And, when I was in school, he was considered not one of the greatest presidents, but he was the president during World War I. And of course, then as I got older and you read about World War I and you read about how he told, the suffragettes that they had to wait for the vote because of the war. And so all these other things. And then you start to read about his racism, and I didn't know he was from the South, but maybe it just explained to us, because you had mentioned Woodrow Wilson earlier.
Yeah. Look, the modern Princeton as a modern university came into existence because of his leadership. 8 years as the president. In some ways, I think he's responsible for building the graduate school, really pulling Princeton out of a kind of narrow kind of party school into a serious intellectual space. So Princeton's self-identity is bound up with Woodrow Wilson. But Princeton didn't admit its first African-American student in 1945, much later than Harvard and Yale and Brown and Cornell and the like. Princeton often says, thank God for Dartmouth, because it's often, at least we don't have a Dinesh D'Souza. But I'm just kidding. No, not actually. I'm not. This idea of Princeton being the Southern Ivy. Jimmy couldn't stand. He actually worked a little bit outside of Princeton. Couldn't stand this place. There's a story where he was in one of the diners on Route 1, right down the street from Princeton, where a waitress refused to serve him, and he threw a glass at her head and broke the glass and had to run for his life. That's Princeton. Princeton wouldn't admit Paul Robeson. He had to go to school down the street to Rutgers. So even as they talk about how important Woodrow Wilson was to the university, he brought his noxious racist views, which found a home here. And so as the first Southern president to be elected after the Civil War, he resegregated the federal government, D.C. He did a screening of Birth of a Nation and celebrated that film, which was ironically, inaugurated American film, but was rooted in a profound lie about Reconstruction, right? So there's so much about how profoundly racist Wilson was, that to tell the story about him without grappling with that is not just simply a moral blindness, but an egregious moral error. And so I think what Princeton has decided to do is to say that Wilson is important to its self-understanding, but we don't want to commend his values to our students. He represents what we were, not what we are and what we aspire to be. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
Wow. That is a good way to put it. That does it. Sorry I kept you so long.
Man, I could talk to you all day, Mike. Appreciate you, man.
Well, please come back and do this again, okay? This is
anytime.
Thank you, Eddie Glaude, for being part of this podcast. I've wanted to have you on since the beginning, and we're only 4 months, a little over 4 months old, and but it's been a real pleasure to talk to you, and also thank you for writing this book. It's called Begin Again, and I encourage everybody to pick it up. Eddie is the chair of the African American Studies Department at Princeton University. His other books, check them out too: Democracy in Black, etc. It's keep doing what you're doing. It's so important, and we'll be there with you.
I'm blessed to walk this journey with you, bro. Let's just keep fighting.
Thank you, Eddie. Thanks so much. And thanks everybody for listening to Rumble. Today I'm Michael Moore, and we'll be back in a couple of days. And we've just passed our 12 millionth listener, 12 million downloads of this in these 4+ months. Thank you to all of you who keep listening and keep telling others about this podcast. Be well, be safe, and we'll talk soon.